Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria and also Eastern Antique Arms. And this is going to be a relatively short video to show one particular type of cutlass, not the one I'm holding, that I've come across. And many of you will know that I'm a big fan of cutlasses. The Royal Naval Cutlass of 1845, which is what I'm holding in my right hand here, is one of my favourite British military swords. And they're just magnificent things. They're big and beefy, they're as chunky and heavy as a sort of medieval arming sword. They cut fantastically. Obviously they can stab pretty well as well, but they're great cutters. They are completely and utterly made of steel and iron. We've got an iron guard, an iron grip and a steel blade, and they're slightly curved. They're a good combination cut and thrust weapon that basically you could use against anything in any era, against anyone. They're just like super weapons. So they're kind of out of their time period in that sense, in that they would be a great weapon and a great sidearm in any period, in pretty much any context. They've got everything you want. They cut great, they thrust great, they've got good hand protection, and they're practically indestructible. I love the things. But there are some variations of the 1845 Royal Navy Cutlass, as shown here. So the standard version has usually around a 29-inch blade. And what I've got here, just to show briefly as an interlude to the main thing I want to show, is the adapted version. And you may be can see already, this one's in slightly nicer condition than the previous one, but you may be able to see that this one is a little bit shorter and a little bit pointier. And so in 1887 and 88 they converted, in fact this one is marked with the letter C and the numbers 88 on the side, and in 1888 this sword was converted from one of these. So this would have been made previously. It is an 1845 pattern, but you can perhaps see, if I put them hilt by hilt, that it is about 2 inches shorter. And what they did was they shortened these from 29 inches to 27 inches, and also they very subtly changed the shape of the point. In fact, if I just hold these a bit differently and come a bit closer to the camera, so they were putting an emphasis at this point on using the weapon more as a thrusting implement. Did this really make any difference? I don't really think so, no. I mean, all they did was they gave up 2 inches of reach. Did they make it a more effective thrusting weapon? Not really. You could argue that making it slightly shorter makes it slightly more nimble and perhaps more wieldable in small spaces, in below decks, or just in tightly packed in masses of soldiers, or sailors rather. I don't know. Personally, I think it was an awful lot of effort for not very much gain. And I think as an overall weapon, I think the slightly longer 29-inch blade rather than the 27 or 27.5-inch blade of the converted version, I think having that extra reach is a nice thing, especially as you're going to be facing people with bayonets and boarding pikes and things like this, or clubbed muskets, or potentially if you're on land you could be facing, you know, dervishes with sword and shield or spear and shield, or whoever. The naval brigade using these cutlasses didn't only fight on board ships, they also fought on board land, famously in the Indian Mutiny, in the Sudan campaigns, and so on and so forth. So these swords were used on land against people with everything from spears to tulwars to bayonets to everything else. So was it worth shortening them and making them a bit more pointy? I would say no. Arguably the only benefit in my mind to doing it is that perhaps you aid penetration slightly, maybe by making the point a bit more nimble, and by making the blade a bit shorter, arguably you make it proportionately stiffer. Anyway, let's put that one aside for a minute, and now let's go to the main thing that I wanted to show in this video. So this is the standard 1845 pattern naval cutlass that came in, surprise surprise, in 1845. Now 1845 is an important year for the development of swords in the British Army and Navy, because new blade types came in. There were lots of changes going on. There were also changes with firearms starting to come in at this point, from pistols right the way through to long arms, rifled arms starting to make a bit more of a common appearance, certainly by 1850. And sword blades changed in 1845, certainly for officers' swords. Now, in terms of the cutlass, it was important as well, because the 1845 pattern cutlass ushered in a new era of cutlasses. Prior to that, the situation, the kind of evolution or development of cutlasses in the British Navy is a little bit harder to trace, in that there was the famous figure 8 cutlass, which is often referred to as being something of the Napoleonic Wars, but we know that the figure 8 cutlass actually goes way back into the 18th century. And actually, we don't really know when the figure 8 cutlass first came about, when it first started to be used exactly. And Nick Thomas, for example, who some of you will know from his channel, from the AHF, he's very interested in kind of Georgian era weapons. And so actually, you know, I know that he has spoken a little bit about the figure 8 cutlass recently. And, you know, it's a very interesting topic, but and not very well researched. The only, or the main book that talks about naval swords, British naval swords, and their development in the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries is a 2-volume work, 2 books, which is quite expensive usually, by authors called Annis and May, or May and Annis. That was written some time ago, I think about 3 decades ago, and that book I think is now out of print. In fact, I'm pretty sure it is. I've got actually 2 sets of those by luck, which I found in old bookshops. But even they weren't really clear on the early development of the British naval cutlass. And so what came before the 1845, we can say it's the figure 8 cutlass, but there were other models of cutlass. Now it does seem that this style of hilt, which we generally refer to as the 1845 style hilt with this ribbed grip, integrated pommel section and bowl guard, which is a great hilt, it does seem likely that this hilt was actually developed before 1845. Cutlasses seem to have been developed more on smaller scale orders and for individual ships. So, for example, in the year, let's say 1815, end of the Napoleonic Wars, you could find a range of different cutlasses on different Royal Navy ships. They weren't all the same. You find some with curved blades, some with straight blades, some with double-edged, some were longer, some were shorter. Now, somewhere in that period, somewhere around 1845 and maybe just before, some people have written about the fact that some cavalry sword blades were being basically sent out, replaced essentially in cavalry regiments, were used for cutlasses. Now, I'd always been somewhat sceptical about this, to be completely honest, because you don't see a lot of them around. You see a lot of figure 8 cutlasses, and then you see a lot of 1845 cutlasses, and then you see later models like the 1900 and the 1888 conversions and this sort of thing. And you see the bayonet cutlasses as well. But you don't see lots of cutlasses around with cut down cavalry sword blades. So I've always been kind of skeptical about whether this actually happened or whether it was just a very isolated incident. But I have here, we finally got around to it, the sword that I want to show you, and that is this. Now, this is, you will see, the hilt is the same model of hilt, same design, pretty much, well, exactly, in fact. It is the 1845 model of hilt. That is not to say that the 1845 model of hilt wasn't already in existence before 1845, just to confuse matters. Because there were lots of experimental cutlasses, even going back to the Napoleonic era, certainly in the years between the end of the Napoleonic Wars, when there was lots of ordnance, there were lots of weapons lying around from the wars that weren't needed anymore, so for a long time, probably for a couple of decades, there probably wasn't any need to make new cutlasses, because the Royal Navy already had thousands of cutlasses, and they didn't need more, because after the war they, you know, there was a contraction of forces. They didn't need so much armed forces and military equipment as they did while they were fighting France. So there would have been cutlasses around in abundance, and you know, a cutlass is a basic cut and thrust object. It doesn't suddenly evolve, it doesn't suddenly become more, you know, if we look at a weapon like this cutlass from 1845, it's not functionally any different to a cutlass from 100 years earlier. It's got a guard, it's got a hilt, and it's got a cut and thrust blade, and it's fairly beefy, you know. So they didn't need to bring out new cutlasses, but swords, like other weapons and other things, even ships themselves, do wear out. Even people, it has to be said, do wear out. And so with natural wear and tear, eventually they had to replace the cutlasses, and eventually that's where the 1845 model comes in. But there is a period in which maybe old cavalry sword blades were perhaps reused on cutlasses, and here we have evidence of that being the case. So I'll just put the 1845 down for a minute. I can't tell you when this combo dates to exactly. We could say 1845, but then why would they be putting a cavalry sword blade? And I'll talk about what the blade is. Let's see if you can guess. I will reveal in this video, but let's see if you're correct. See if you can guess what sword blade this is. Why would they be using a cavalry sword blade on an 1845 hilt if the 1845 is being manufactured in large numbers? And especially if this is an 1845 pattern hilt, why would you buy a new hilt and then stick an old blade in it? Why not just buy the whole sword? Maybe they were doing special offers. If you had some blades lying around, you could just buy the hilt and then have them fitted up. I don't know. And this is one of these aspects sometimes we are spoilt for documentation and resources when it comes to studying military swords and 19th century military history. Because yes, compared to the 18th century or anything before that, we've got vast amounts of source material. But there are some things we just simply don't know because it's not recorded, or at least no one has found it recorded yet. So this is a cavalry sword blade cut down. I'll tell you how I know that in a second. Mounted onto an 1845 pattern hilt. I can't say when they were married up, but my guess is either around 1845 or possibly earlier than that. Okay, it could be that this is a pre-1845 hilt. It might be from let's say the 1830s, and so it's not yet officially 1845 pattern sword, cutlass rather, but this is a kind of almost like a predecessor of the 1845 hilt, maybe. But the blade, right, how do I know it's a cavalry sword blade? Well, first of all, how you tell that a blade is cut down is if you look, this is a fullered blade. Yeah, you can probably see that there's a fuller going up here. There's a small ricasso at the base of the blade. Just get it to focus there. So you can see there's a small ricasso and then there's a shallow fuller running all the way up here. But then when we get to the tip, you'll notice the fuller carries on straight out of the end of the blade. So it hasn't had an end formed to the fuller, and there is no tip specially forged into the blade. Ergo, we can quite clearly see that this blade was originally longer, and I would guess it was about that length, which is almost certainly what it was, because this is a 29-inch blade. Now that's important for a second, because if this was made in 1845 or after, which is possible, using an old blade, they have deliberately made it the exact same length as the 1845 pattern. So despite the fact it's not an 1845 pattern blade, it is 1845 pattern length. Okay, so they may have been using an old blade for economic reasons or any other kind of reason, but they have shortened the cavalry sword blade to be the same length as the regulation blade. Now, what sword is this from? I shall reveal. So think straight blade, straight cavalry sword blade, single-edged, essentially a backsword blade, and now think Sean Bean. That's right. This is a 1796 heavy cavalry sword, trooper's sword, shortened with, it would have originally been about 35 inches. So it's had about, let's say about 5 inches removed, 5 or 6 inches removed off, there you go, that's 6 inches, honest, removed off the tip down to here. It was a hatchet pointed, although some were famously spear pointed for the Battle of Waterloo, or perhaps even before that. So it's had about 6 inches removed off the tip, then it's had a new tip ground onto it to make it the regulation 29 inches, and then it's mounted into the 1845 pattern hilt. How's the end result? Very, very nice, I have to say. So this has been ground to have a very good cutting edge on it. So good that I'm pretty sure I could take this out in the garden right now. All I've done is cleaned the rust off this. There was light surface rust. Just oil WD-40 and some wire wool for 5 minutes. Job done. I've left it at that stage, not done anything more. But I could go right out in the garden now, fill a water bottle and cut straight through it with this sword. It's got a lovely heft to it. It's still a heavy sword. But compared to the regulation 1845, so if I don't look at the sword and I wave it around, think, okay, how does that feel in my hand? Okay, put that down and now wave this one around. So I can tell that it's straight and not curved. I've spoken about this previously. With a curved blade, you have a phenomenon that when you start to swing it, the trailing tip will naturally align the edge, and it's one of the advantages of a curved blade. It's one of the reasons why people think that curved blades cut better on average than straight blades, is because they naturally align themselves. So it's not actually that they mechanically cut better necessarily, but that you're more likely to do a true edge cut with a curved blade. So I can feel the fact that this is slightly curved, even though it's a slight curve. Some people might dispute or doubt that. I personally believe that that's true. Even with a slight curve, it aids edge alignment, and I think that's why they did it. So I can feel it's curved, but and obviously I'm predominantly right-handed, although I write with my left hand, so I'm a bit ambidextrous. This is slightly lighter at the tip, and that's actually not surprising, because when you consider this was originally 6 inches longer, this blade, so actually the distal taper is quite great on a cavalry sword blade because it was designed to be 6 inches longer but still have a total weight somewhat similar to the Cutlass. So the Cutlass is a beefier blade up here. That does mean there's potential disadvantage that this sword is thinner and therefore more flexible. So if you don't penetrate what you're stabbing into, you may possibly experience more flex, more loss of energy, and therefore less penetration with the blade, which is thinner in the foible. That's a possible disadvantage. The advantage, however, is the sword is a little bit more nimble at the tip than the standard 1845. But anyway, there we go. I won't say much more about it. It is a 1796 heavy cavalry trooper's sword, shortened by 6 inches, mounted onto an 1845 Cutlass hilt that dates to probably around 1845. Very, very nice end result, and I'm very pleased to have found this. It's a very nice handling Cutlass, and it adds to my kind of 1845 collection, Cutlass collection, as it were. Anyway, give us a like and a subscribe if you haven't already. As always, there's extra videos on Patreon if you're into that kind of thing. I might be talking some more about this actually on Patreon soon. And I will see you guys soon for another video. Cheers for watching. Take care. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.